The heavy silk of her wedding dress felt like a beautiful, suffocating prison. Margot had a burner phone, a fake passport, and exactly 6 minutes to escape Boston's most ruthless crime boss. She thought her plan was flawless. She didn't know he was already waiting in the getaway car. Margot Hale was not the kind of woman men went to war over. At 24, she had spent most of her life blending into the background, fully aware of how the world viewed her. She was a fat woman in a society that worshipped sharp angles and hollow cheeks. She was soft, plush, and carried her weight with a quiet dignity, preferring the safety of her ledgers and balance sheets over the superficial glitz of Boston's elite. She worked as the head bookkeeper for her father's freight company, Hale Cargo Co., located in a dusty warehouse off Route 14 near the old rail yard. It was a quiet, unassuming life until her father, Walter Hale, made the fatal mistake of borrowing $4.5 million from the Costas organization to keep his failing business afloat. When Walter couldn't pay, the organization didn't send broken-nosed enforcers to collect. They sent the boss himself, Dimitri Costas. Dimitri was a ghost in Boston's underworld, a man whose name was whispered in the back rooms of City Hall and the high-stakes tables of underground card rooms. He was ruthless, calculating, and possessed a chilling, aristocratic calmness. When he stepped into the cramped offices of Hale Cargo, wearing a bespoke burgundy suit, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Margot had been sitting at her desk, her thick thighs pressing against the cheap wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected Dimitri to demand the deed to the company. She expected violence. She did not expect his dark, predatory eyes to lock onto her and stay there. Your father owes me a debt that his blood cannot repay, Dimitri said, Kule. His voice, a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. He hadn't looked at Walter. He only looked at Margot, his gaze tracing the soft curve of her jaw, the fullness of her figure, the wide flare of her hips beneath her modest cardigan. But I am a businessman, Mr. Hale. I am looking to transition my assets into legitimate corporate holdings. For that, I need a wife, someone smart, someone who understands numbers, someone who won't ask foolish questions. Walter had stammered, pale and trembling. Take the company. Costas, please. I don't want the company, Dimitri replied. Finally, stepping closer to Margot's desk, he leaned over, planting 2 large, scarred hands on her ledgers. He smelled of vetiver, cold rain, and quiet danger. I want her. Margot marries me, and the debt is forgiven. You refuse, and I will burn this warehouse to the ground with you inside it. For Margot, there was no choice. She loved her father, despite his staggering incompetence. But more than that, she saw the terrifying finality in Dimitri's eyes. She was an anomaly in his world. The crime boss was usually surrounded by manufactured, wife-thin models and socialites. Yet Dimitri looked at her with a ravenous intensity that made her skin prickle. He didn't see her weight as a flaw. He looked at her as if she were a feast he had been starved of. The engagement was announced 5 days later in the Boston Herald. It was a complete shock to the city's high society. To the public, it was a sudden, whirlwind romance between a wealthy investor and a logistics heiress. To Margot, It was a death sentence. Dmitri spared no expense. He bought her a sprawling penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor and showered her in diamonds that felt like heavy chains. He was relentlessly attentive, yet utterly commanding. But Margot was not a submissive trophy. Her sharp mind, the very thing Dmitri claimed to admire, went to work. She knew she couldn't marry him. If she signed those papers, she would be complicit in his empire of extortion and violence. So, beneath the guise of a docile, overwhelmed bride-to-be, Margot began to plot. She quietly skimmed small amounts of cash from the wedding budget, just enough to hire Desmond Faulkner, a notorious underworld fixer who specialized in disappearing acts. She met him twice, both times in the back office of a laundromat, 3 neighborhoods from the penthouse, wearing sunglasses indoors like a woman in a bad spy film, feeling faintly ridiculous even as her pulse hammered against her throat. You understand what happens if this fails. Desmond had said the second time, sliding a manila envelope across a folding table stacked with unopened bills. I understand what happens if I don't try, Margot answered. He'd studied her for a long moment, not with pity, which she'd braced for, but with something closer to respect. Most people who come to me are running from something small. A bad marriage. A debt collector. You're running from Dmitri Kostas. I'm aware. Then you should also be aware that nobody runs from Dmitri Kostas. They get let go. There's a difference. And most people who think they've found the first don't realize until it's too late that they were only ever experiencing the second. Margot hadn't understood what he meant. Not then. She only knew she couldn't sign her name to a marriage that would make her complicit in extortion, in violence, in whatever quietly brutal machinery kept a man like Dmitri in bespoke suits and untouchable silence. Desmond arranged everything a shadow vehicle, a flight out of Logan International Airport under the name Sarah Higgins, and a quiet life waiting in a small coastal town in Maine. All Margot had to do was make it out of the hotel before she walked down the aisle. The day of the wedding arrived with a bitter, biting chill rolling off the harbor. The venue was the iconic Kavanagh Hotel on Newbury Street, completely bought out and locked down by Dmitri's men. Inside the opulent bridal suite, Margot stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror. Her custom-made gown was a masterpiece of heavy ivory silk, vintage lace, and intricate pearl beadwork. The designer had masterfully tailored the fabric to hug her generous curves, cinching her waist and flowing out into a dramatic train. She looked breathtaking, a vision of classic, voluptuous beauty. But beneath the layers of silk, her heart was beating like a trapped bird. You look beautiful. Margot, her younger sister, Ren, whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Ren was the only one who knew about the escape. Is the hallway clear? Margot asked. Her voice tight. Ren peeked out the heavy oak door. The 2 guards are down at the end of the hall. The catering staff is bringing up the champagne carts now. It's exactly like Desmond said. Margot took a deep breath, the boning of her corset pressing into her ribs. She reached under the skirts of her dress, her thick thighs brushing together as she strapped the burner phone and the fake passport to her leg with a specialized garter. She slipped off her restrictive high heels, opting for a pair of soft white ballet flats she had hidden in her makeup bag. I love you. Vren, tell Dad I'm sorry, Margot whispered, pulling her sister into a fierce, desperate hug. Just run. Margot, don't look back. At 2:40 in the afternoon, perfectly timed with the caterer's arrival, a planned distraction occurred. A smoke alarm tripped in the hotel's main kitchen, sending a wave of panicked staff rushing through the corridors. In the chaos, Margot slipped out of the bridal suite. She moved with surprising agility, her heart pounding in her ears. The heavy silk of her dress swished around her ankles, a dangerous liability. So she gathered the fabric in her fists, hiking it up to her knees. She darted into the service stairwell, the heavy fire door clicking shut behind her. Down. She had to go down 8 flights. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The physical exertion of rushing down the concrete stairs in a 35-pound gown was immense. Sweat beaded on her forehead, ruining her immaculate makeup. Her calves burned, but the adrenaline masked the pain. She was doing it. She was actually escaping the devil of Boston. She burst through the ground floor exit, spilling out into the dimly lit private loading dock at the rear of the hotel. The biting November wind hit her bare shoulders, making her shiver. There it was, just as Desmond promised. A sleek black Lincoln Town car idling near the dumpsters. Its engine, a low, comforting hum. The tinted windows hid the driver, but the hazard lights flashed twice. The signal. Margot practically threw herself toward the vehicle. She grabbed the heavy metal handle of the rear passenger door and yanked it open. She climbed inside, dragging the massive skirts of her wedding dress in behind her, gasping for air as she collapsed onto the plush leather seats. Go, she panted, not looking up, busy trying to untangle the layers of tulle from her legs. Desmond, please, just drive. He's going to realize I'm gone any second. The car didn't move. The silence in the vehicle was sudden and absolute, heavy with a thick, suffocating dread. Slowly, Margot raised her head. The man sitting in the driver's seat didn't turn around. Instead, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the loading dock, dressed in a flawless midnight blue tuxedo. Dimitri. Oh, Margot's blood ran ice cold. She lunged for the door handle, but before her fingers could even graze the plastic, a sharp electronic thwack echoed through the cabin. The doors locked. Dimitri walked to the side of the car, his movements slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. He opened the rear door on the opposite side and slid into the back seat next to her. The door shut behind him with a heavy thud, sealing them inside the soundproof cabin. Margot pressed her back against the window, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Dimitri didn't look angry. That was the most terrifying part. He looked entirely composed, almost amused, as he slowly reached out and adjusted a piece of lace that had fallen over Margot's trembling shoulder. Did you really think? Dimitri said, his voice a velvet purr that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. That you could hire Desmond Faulkner in my city without my permission. Margot couldn't speak. Her throat was completely dry. Desmond works for me. Margot. He always has. Dimitri continued, his dark eyes trailing down the flushed, panicked skin of her chest, resting on the frantic rise and fall of her heavy breathing. I let you plan this. I let you buy the passport. I let you think you had a choice because I wanted to see how far you would go. He leaned in, the scent of vetiver and impending doom wrapping around her. He reached down, his large hand brushing against her thick thigh, right where the fake passport was strapped. He pulled the document free and casually tossed it onto the floorboards. "I told you I wanted a smart wife," Dimitri whispered, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. He grabbed her chin, his grip firm, forcing her to look into his bottomless, predatory eyes. "But the game ends here," he signaled the driver. The black Lincoln pulled away from the loading dock, slipping seamlessly into the chaotic Boston traffic, moving farther and farther away from the airport. "Where are we going?" Margot choked out, tears of absolute defeat finally spilling over her lashes. Dimitri's thumb gently, almost lovingly, wiped a tear from her cheek. "We are going to the church," Dimitri said softly, a dark, possessive smile curving his lips. "You are going to walk down that aisle, and you are my wife now." The wedding ceremony was a blurred nightmare of flashing cameras, heavy incense, and the suffocating grip of Dimitri's hand on hers. Margot stood at the altar of St. Brennan's Cathedral, her responses automatic, her spirit entirely fractured. When Dimitri slid the cold, heavy platinum band onto her finger, it felt like the closing of a vault. The reception in the Fenwick room of the Cavanagh Hotel was a lavish display of power. Politicians, judges, and underworld lieutenants mingled under crystal chandeliers, all pretending this was a romance and not a transaction. Margot sat at the head table, the heavy silk of her dress weighing her down like a physical manifestation of her despair. She refused to eat, refused to smile, staring blankly at the towering 7-tier cake. "You are drawing unnecessary attention." "Mia sposa," Dimitri murmured, his breath warm against her temple. He reached under the heavy damask tablecloth, his large hand resting assertively on her thick thigh. The heat of his palm seared through her silk stockings. "Smile for the cameras. Margot, let them see a woman deeply in love." "I am a prisoner," Margot replied, her voice barely a whisper, not daring to look at him. "Do not ask me to act like a willing one." Dimitri's jaw tightened. "Tonight, you are my wife. Tomorrow, you will see exactly why I chose you." A judge's wife leaned across the table, champagne glass raised, oblivious to everything beneath the surface. "You two make such a striking couple. How did you meet?" "Through business," Dimitri answered smoothly, before Margot could form a single word. She has a mind for numbers. Most men in this room would envy. "How romantic," the woman sighed. Entirely convinced, Margot stared at her untouched plate long after the woman turned away, thinking of all the ways a sentence could be true and still be a lie. He hadn't described how they met. He described what she was worth. She wondered, staring at the 7-tier cake she would not cut, whether there was a version of her future where those two facts ever stopped being the same thing. The next morning, Margot awoke in the master suite of Dimitri's sprawling penthouse atop the Meridian Tower. The bed was massive, tangled in silk sheets. But Dimitri was already gone, leaving only the faint scent of vetiver behind. Margot pulled a thick velvet robe over her soft, plush curves. Her body aching from the tension of the previous day, she found him in his private study, a room lined with dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the churning gray waters of the harbor. He was sitting behind a massive desk, nursing an espresso. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a Fortune 500 CEO. "Sit," Dmitri commanded, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. Margot obeyed, wrapping the robe tighter around her full figure. Suddenly hyper-aware of how deeply his gaze raked over her body, the same way it had that first afternoon in the cramped warehouse office. Except now, there was nowhere left to hide from it, and, strangely, less reason to want to. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a fierce, dark hunger that made her pulse race despite her hatred for him. He slid a thick manila folder across the desk. Stamped across the top in bold red ink was the logo of Voss and Ashford, one of the most ruthless forensic accounting firms on the East Coast. "What is this?" Margot asked, her brow furrowing. "That," Dmitri said, leaning back and steepling his fingers, "is the true financial history of Hale Cargo over the last 7 years. I suggest you read it. Margot, your mind is sharp. You will see what your father could not hide from me." Margot opened the file, her eyes trained in ledgers and balance sheets, scanned the first page, then the second. Her breath hitched. The numbers didn't make sense. The $4.5 million her father had borrowed from the Costas organization wasn't lost to bad investments or failing contracts. It was deliberately diverted. She traced the routing numbers. Shell corporations on the Isle of Man. A private offshore account with Osterman Private Bank, Margot whispered, her voice trembling as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over her. He didn't lose the money. He embezzled it. He stole your money and hid it. 7.8 million in total. Once you account for the skimmed profits from his own employees' pension fund. Dmitri corrected softly. Walter Hale is not a desperate, failing businessman. Margot, he is a thief. He knew I would eventually come to collect. He offered you to me not to save his company, but to buy himself time. He believed I would use you, grow bored, and dispose of you while he quietly relocated to Lisbon. Margot dropped the file. The walls of the study felt like they were closing in. Her father, the man she had sacrificed her entire life for, the man she had willingly walked into the devil's arms to save, had sold her for a retirement fund. He had known Dmitri's reputation. He had expected her to be abused or worse. Killed. A hot, blinding rage erupted in Margot's chest. It was a vicious, unfamiliar emotion, burning away the timid, compliant bookkeeper she had always been. Tears spilled down her cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of absolute fury. Dmitri stood, walking slowly around the desk. He knelt beside her chair, a stark contrast to his imposing height. He reached out, his scarred hands gently cupping her face. For a man so immersed in violence, his touch was agonizingly tender. The world has always underestimated you because you do not fit their narrow, fragile definition of value, Dmitri said, his voice a low rumble. Your father saw you as a shield. I see you as a queen. I did not buy you. Margot, I freed you. He wiped the angry tears from her jaw. You are brilliant. You see the invisible lines that connect money, power, and leverage. My empire is vast, but it is chaotic. I am transitioning into legitimate holdings, real estate, commercial shipping, municipal contracts, I need a partner who understands the anatomy of a corporate takeover. I need you." Margot looked into his dark eyes, the terrifying reality of her situation shifting. She wasn't just a captive wife in a gilded cage. Dimitri was handing her the keys to the kingdom. "What happens to my father?" Margot asked, her voice turning cold, a hardened edge clipping her words. Dimitri smiled, a dark, predatory curve of his lips. "Whatever you want to happen to him, mia regina. The ledger is yours now. Over the next 8 months, Boston's underworld felt the seismic shift. Margot Costas stopped running. She took the sprawling, unorganized, legitimate assets of the Costas organization and ruthlessly streamlined them, operating out of a sleek corner office in the Harrington Tower. Margot became a phantom terror in the corporate world. She wore custom Landru suits that hugged her generous curves and celebrated her plush figure, a physical manifestation of her newly claimed power. She was no longer the soft, invisible bookkeeper. She was the architect of Dimitri's new empire. She absorbed rival logistics firms, restructured shell companies, and laundered millions through impenetrable, perfectly legal corporate structures. And Dimitri worshipped her, behind closed doors. His obsession with her mind and her body only deepened. He treated her heavy, voluptuous frame like a religious artifact. His devotion absolute and unwavering. Not every boardroom welcomed her. In her 4th month, running the legitimate side of the empire, a rival shipping magnate named Ellis Thorne made the mistake of laughing when she sat down across from him at the negotiating table. "They sent the bookkeeper," he'd said to his associates, loud enough for her to hear, instead of the boss. Margot had opened her folder without looking up. "Mr. Thorne, your company owes 4 separate creditors, a combined total I'm fairly confident you haven't disclosed to your own board. I have the routing numbers memorized. Would you like to continue the joke? Or would you like to discuss terms?" The room had gone very quiet. By the end of the meeting, Thorne's company belonged, on paper, to a holding entity Margot had built from nothing. And Thorne himself had shaken her hand twice, once out of habit, and once, she suspected, out of genuine fear. Stories like that one traveled fast through Boston's business circles. Within a season, nobody laughed when she sat down, but power in Boston never goes unchallenged. And Margot was about to face the true cost of wearing the crown. The autumn gala at the Ashcombe Museum of Modern Art was the social event of the year. The East Wing, with its sweeping glass ceilings and stark white architecture, was packed with the city's elite. Mayors, senators, and billionaires sipped champagne beneath priceless works of art. It was Margot's masterpiece. She had orchestrated the entire event under the guise of the Costas Foundation, cementing their family's transition from underworld operators to untouchable philanthropists. She had spent 3 weeks on the guest list alone, cross-referencing donor histories, political affiliations, and old grudges most people in the room had long since learned to smile through. Every seating arrangement was a small act of diplomacy. Every centerpiece had been chosen to complement, rather than compete with, the museum's own collection. Even Dimitri, who rarely praised anything aloud. He had walked the empty ballroom the afternoon before the event and simply said, "This is the first room in this city that has ever looked exactly the way I imagined power should look." Margot had taken the compliment the way she took most things from him now carefully, turning it over for hidden edges before deciding, finally, to let herself enjoy it. Margot stood near a massive Rothko, holding a crystal flute of sparkling water. She wore a deep aubergine velvet gown that gripped her thick waist and flared beautifully over her wide hips. Diamonds dripped from her collarbones. She caught Dimitri's eye across the room. He was speaking with a city councilman, looking lethal in a midnight black tuxedo, the heat in his stare, even from 60 feet away, made Margot's breath catch. But the idyllic triumph was a fragile illusion. Margot's mind, always processing data, began to notice anomalies. She had personally vetted the private security detail, Warden Protective Services, hiring them for the night. The contract stipulated that all guards wear a specific bronze lapel pin shaped like a compass. As Margot watched a guard secure the exits near the catering kitchens, she frowned. The guard's lapel was bare. She turned her gaze to the mezzanine. 2 more guards standing unnaturally rigid, their hands hovering too close to their suit jackets. No bronze pins. Her blood ran cold. A hostile takeover. There was only one man bold enough to strike Dimitri in a public venue filled with politicians. Victor Callahan, the aging boss of the Northside crew, who was rapidly losing territory to Margot's aggressive corporate expansions. Margot didn't panic. She didn't scream. The timid girl who had tried to run away from her wedding was dead. The woman who remained was a cold, calculating tactician. She smoothly placed her glass on a passing waiter's tray and unclasped her diamond clutch. Inside was an encrypted earpiece directly linked to Dimitri's personal enforcers. She slipped it into her ear, hiding it beneath her dark hair. "Nico," Margot whispered, turning her back to the room and pretending to admire the painting. "We have a breach. At least 4 imposters in warden uniforms. South exits and the mezzanine. Understood. Mrs. Costas." Nico's gruff voice crackled in her ear. "Extracting the boss now. Stay put." Margot turned around just in time to see Victor Callahan himself stepping out of the VIP elevator. He wasn't there to assassinate Dimitri quietly. He was there to make a public statement. But what made Margot's heart stop was the man walking nervously 3 paces behind Callahan. Walter Halle, her father. Callahan had found the one man who hated Dimitri enough to supply the architectural blueprints of the museum's security grid blueprints Walter still had access to through residual ties in the municipal planning office. Chaos erupted silently before the public even noticed. Nico and 2 enforcers moved to flank Dimitri. But Callahan's men drew suppressed weapons. The muffled thip-thip of gunfire was masked by the swelling classical music from the string quartet. Glass shattered above them. Panic swept the room as the politicians finally realized what was happening. Diving for cover in a wave of tailored suits and evening gowns, Dimitri was trapped. He had been pushed into a dead-end corridor leading to the museum's administrative offices, pinned down by heavy fire from Callahan's men. Margot knew Nico couldn't reach him in time. She had to act, lifting the heavy velvet skirts of her gown. Margot moved rapidly through the terrified crowd, using her knowledge of the event's logistics. She bypassed the main floor and slipped into the catering service elevator. "Margot, what are you doing? Get out of the building." Dimitri's voice barked through the earpiece, ragged and breathless. "I'm fixing this," Margot replied, her voice remarkably steady. She reached the security control room on the 3rd floor. The two warden guards inside were unconscious on the floor, neutralized by Callahan's men. Margot stepped over them, her breath heavy, and approached the main terminal. She had designed the security override protocols herself when she negotiated the venue contract. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed the firewall with the backdoor codes she had memorized. On the monitors, she saw Callahan's men advancing down the corridor toward Dimitri's position. "Hold on, Dimitri," she murmured. Margot slammed the enter key. Instantly, the museum's automated fire suppression system engaged, but only in that specific corridor. Heavy steel fire doors dropped from the ceiling on both ends of the hallway with a deafening crash, trapping Callahan and his men inside, isolating them completely from Dimitri. Seconds later, the halon gas system activated, sucking the oxygen out of the sealed corridor. Through the monitor, Margot watched Callahan and his hitmen collapse against the glass, gasping for air. Their weapons useless. It was over. 20 minutes later, the Boston PD had surrounded the building, heavily bribed by the Costas payroll to handle the unfortunate gas leak quietly. The lead detective, a tired man named Prescott, who had learned years ago which questions in this city were worth asking twice, took Margot's statement in the museum's east lobby while paramedics moved through the crowd behind him. "You're saying you triggered the fire suppression system yourself?" "I designed the override protocols for the venue contract," Margot said, her voice steady despite the tremor still working its way out of her hands. "When I realized there was a breach, I used them." Prescott studied her for a long moment, the way men in his profession studied people they suspected of knowing far more than they were saying. "That's a remarkably calm answer for a woman who just watched 4 men nearly asphyxiate 20 feet from a room full of senators. I've had a very educational 8 months. Detective." He didn't write that down, but he didn't forget it either. The official incident report, when it was filed 3 days later, described a gas leak in a service corridor, a swift facilities response, and no fatalities. Nobody asked who had paid for the report to read that way. Dimitri burst into the security room, his tuxedo torn, blood grazing his cheek. He looked frantic, terrified, an emotion Margot had never seen on the ruthless crime boss when he saw her standing by the monitors. Completely unharmed, he crossed the room in 2 massive strides and pulled her into a crushing embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. "You foolish, brilliant woman." He breathed against her skin, his hands gripping her thick waist as if she were the only anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. "You could have been killed. I told you," Margot said softly, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. "I understand the anatomy of a takeover. Nobody takes what belongs to me." Dimitri pulled back, looking at her with a reverence that bordered on religious. His hands cupped her face, smearing a faint trace of his blood on her cheek. "You are my empire, Margot. Everything I have, everything I am, it is yours." She held his gaze. Blood and adrenaline and something far more complicated tangled together in her chest. "Then stop treating me like glass," she said quietly, her voice steadier now than it had been in months. "I am not something you protect from the world, Dimitri. I am something you point at it." Something shifted behind his eyes, not quite surprise, closer to recognition. as if she had just described a version of herself he'd suspected existed, but had never heard her say aloud. "Understood," he said simply. And for the first time since the loading dock 8 months ago, it sounded less like a command between them and more like an agreement between equals before they left the museum. Dmitri led Margot to the loading docks, surrounded by 6 heavily armed guards. A single man was kneeling on the cold concrete. Walter Hale. He looked up at Margot, his face pale, trembling in the bitter Boston wind. It was the exact same loading dock where Margot had tried to run away 8 months ago. The poetry of the moment was not lost on her. "Margot, please," Walter begged, tears streaming down his face. "He forced me. Callahan forced me. I'm your father." Margot stood beside Dmitri, her velvet dress pooling on the concrete, radiating a terrifying, icy calm. She looked down at the man who had stolen her future, sold her to a monster, and then tried to have them both killed to cover his tracks. "You were my father," Margot said, her voice echoing in the empty space. "But I am a Costas now." She turned to Dmitri. "Drain his offshore accounts. Every penny. Seize Hale cargo. Dissolve the assets. And leave him with nothing. Ban him from Boston. If he crosses the city limits again, kill him." Walter screamed as the guards dragged him away into the darkness. But Margot didn't flinch. She didn't look back. Dmitri led her to the waiting black Lincoln Town car, the same car she had tried to escape in. He opened the door for her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of dark pride and overwhelming devotion. Margot slid into the back seat, her plush curves settling into the leather. Dmitri climbed in beside her, with a sharp electronic thack. The doors locked. 8 months ago. That sound had been the closing of a coffin. Tonight, Margot smiled. She reached over, her soft hand gripping the lapel of Dmitri's ruined tuxedo, and pulled his lips down to hers. She didn't need to run anymore. She had taken the devil's throne, and the locked door was no longer keeping her in. It was keeping everyone else out. In the weeks that followed, Boston's papers ran cautious, admiring profiles of the Costas Foundation's meteoric rise in philanthropic circles, careful never to ask too many questions about where the money had originally come from. A society columnist for the Herald, who had once described Margot in a single dismissive clause as the surprisingly plain Mrs. Costas, ran a follow-up piece 3 weeks after the gala with a noticeably different tone, crediting her with a corporate mind sharp enough to make grown men flinch, and never once mentioning her weight at all. Margot read that column twice, then folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of her desk, beside nothing else. Because some small victories didn't need company, Wren visited the penthouse every Sunday. Still, half convinced, her sister had married a monster. Slowly coming to understand that the woman running Dmitri's empire from a glass office on the 40th floor bore no resemblance to the trembling bride who had once begged her to keep a hallway clear. "You don't flinch anymore," Wren said one Sunday. Watching Margot sign a stack of documents without looking up twice at the same page, I stopped having the luxury of flinching around month 2. "That's not an answer." Margot set down her pen. "No," she admitted. "It isn't." She looked at her sister for a long moment, weighing how much of the truth was safe to hand across a kitchen island. "I used to think strength meant getting away. Now I think it means deciding what you're willing to become in order to stay standing. Ishos. That's different from being conquered, even if it doesn't always look different from the outside. Ren didn't fully understand that answer. Not that day. But she stopped asking Margot when she planned to leave, and started asking instead what the Foundation's Gala committee needed help with, which Margot understood to be its own kind of forgiveness. Desmond Faulkner, for his part, quietly retired from the disappearing acts business altogether, having learned the hard way that there was no vanishing from a man who owned the city he operated in. He sent Margot a single congratulatory card on her 1-year anniversary, unsigned, containing only a pressed flower and a Boston postmark. She kept it in the same drawer as the newspaper column. Margot never spoke of her father again. Not once. Not even in the privacy of the penthouse. Some ledgers, she had learned, were better left closed. There were nights, rare ones, when she woke at 3 in the morning with her heart racing for no reason she could name, and lay very still until she remembered where she was and who was breathing steadily beside her. She never told Dmitri about those nights. Some things, she'd decided, belonged only to her, a small, private country inside a life that otherwise belonged to an empire. And every evening, when Dmitri came home and found her exactly where she always was, behind a desk, surrounded by numbers, utterly unbothered by the weight of everything she now commanded, he understood, more completely than he ever had in his life, that he hadn't simply taken a wife. He had built himself a queen, and somewhere beneath the calculation, the leverage, and the empire neither of them would ever fully escape. Something that had started as a transaction had become, against every reasonable expectation, something that felt uncomfortably, undeniably close to love. Did Margot make the right choice by embracing the darkness? Or should she have kept running? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.